things.
Indeed, it's using language as a source of evidence about human nature, a source of evidence about the cognitive categories that we use to analyze the world, largely through grammatical categories. For example, what do nouns tell us about our concepts of matter? What do prepositions say about the way that we carve up space? What do tenses say about the human conception of time? What do verbs tell us about the human conception of causality? But I don't only analyze cognitive categories. Language also conveys emotion, most of all when we swear, when we either express our emotions through swearing or elicit emotions in others through the use of emotionally evocative taboo terms. And taboo language tells us something about the inventory of human emotions. Language can also tell us about human social relationships. Language is quintessentially social activity. When we converse with someone, we don't just send packets of information back and forth like two modems, but we're always in some relationship with our conversational partner. And language can tell us something about the kinds of relationships that we're mindful of as we proposition and inform and request and persuade and in other ways try to affect people through our words.
So, strangely enough, for language, then, a lot of these social facets we're trying to convey are actually sort of unspoken, aren't they? They're kind of implicit.
Very much, and people aren't even aware of the kinds of adjustments that they do make in their speech. A simple example is politeness. If I were to say, if you could pass the salt, that would be brilliant, it's a statement that, taken literally, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's a, why are you pondering hypothetical possible worlds there at the dinner table? And it's not as if it would be brilliant if you got the salt. Nonetheless, we instantly recognize this as an imperative, give me the salt, but couched in a way that doesn't make it appear as if you're exerting dominance over the person at the other end of the table, that you're not treating them like some kind of underling or flunky. And in more emotionally fraught situations than that, our words are often even more thickly veiled in innuendo. In threats, we often issue a threat in veiled form, like, nice story you got there, would be a real shame if something happened to it. In sexual come-ons, famously, we use innuendos like, would you like to come up and see my etchings? These are all cases in which the very act of offering a proposition can change the nature of the relationship in a way that you may not want to happen if the other person turns you down. And so by burying it in innuendo, forcing the listener to do a little bit of mental spade work to get at the meaning, you give yourself some plausible deniability. That is, if the other person doesn't want to go along, if they're not interested in sex, if they don't want to take the bribe, they can choose to ignore it, and the relationship has not been altered as it would if a bald-faced bribe or sexual proposition were uttered in so many words.
Now, it's difficult to pick out from that whether language is shaping the way people are thinking about these things or whether the way they think about them is shaping the language they use. And this is sort of the million-dollar question, I suppose. And there are various takes on that. What's yours?
I argue against strong forms of the linguistic determinism hypothesis, the hypothesis that we cannot think outside of language, the hypothesis that certain languages render their speakers unable to think certain thoughts, the idea that which language you speak has a strong influence on the kinds of reasoning that you can go through. I think there are cases in which language gives us tools that make it easier to think. Simple example is mathematical calculation, mental arithmetic, where we clearly recite snatches of language to ourselves, like 8 times 7 is 56. We hold in working memory bits of speech that record the intermediate products of a computation. So it's not, of course, as if language is independent of thought. Nonetheless, thought has to be prior for a number of reasons. One is that we have to learn a language when we're children, and language learning is not pure cryptography. It's not just calculating the transitional probabilities of one noise after another. We have to learn what sentences mean, and that means that we have to be able to conceptualize what another person is trying to say and match that up with the words coming out of that person's mouth. Also, language is not invented by a committee. It's not like it's handed down to us like a computer programming language, but it's a grassroots phenomenon. It's the ultimate wiki. It's something that anyone can edit. And people clearly have to have had the thoughts that get labeled with words prior to the words coming into existence. It's also why languages are constantly in flux, why the language of today is different from the language of Shakespeare's time. People are always inventing new forms of jargon, new ways of expressing themselves. And finally, language is too vague and unspecified to serve as a medium of thought. It leaves too many details to the imagination. And when we're talking about thought, we're talking about the imagination. Language is ambiguous. Language is vague. It's sketchy. It only works because it's the tip of an iceberg, that we fill in a lot of the missing details effortlessly when we understand or speak, showing that language must sit on top of a much bigger infrastructure of thought and reasoning.
Vague, unspecified, sketchy are all properties, obviously, that we're familiar with in language, but nevertheless, below all of that, there must be a degree of innateness somewhere. We all are equipped with language and we can all do it, we can all learn it as babies. But what exactly is it that's innate, if these sort of sketchy words and concepts aren't?
In this book, I don't look so much as what aspects of language are innate, but what aspects of conceptual structure or thought might be innate. We don't know. But it can't be particular concepts like a giraffe or a carburetor or a trombone or a doorknob. Those you clearly have to learn from your culture. On the other hand, word learning would be impossible if we didn't have some kinds of conceptual material out of which to form concepts. And if you look at the kinds of concepts that seem to keep reappearing in language after language and in construction after construction, you find that pretty soon you start to turn back on yourself and the same ones keep popping up and leading to important grammatical distinctions. The concept of causation, the concept of intention, the difference between a means and an end, the concept of an object, the distinction between something that has boundaries and the stuff of which it's made, a conception of time as dichotomized or trichotomized between the present, the moment of consciousness, and an interval before it and an interval after it. Concepts at that level of abstraction, the kind of abstraction that Immanuel Kant wrote about several hundred years ago, which don't correspond to any of our actual thoughts, but are the scaffolding or skeletons around which we build concrete thoughts. Those not only seem necessary to give us coherent intelligence, but my interest in them came from the fact they keep popping up over and over again in language. You say, pour water into the glass, but not pour the glass with water. Why can you say fill the glass with water, but not fill water into the glass? The solution to those puzzles kept ending up using these fundamental concepts like causation, like time, like object.
And that's across many different languages.
The particular constructions in a language obviously vary. The particular rules that determine which words you can or can't use vary, but they fall into universal patterns, and they've been documented in hundreds and hundreds of languages.
And this reveals something then about how we see the world as humans, what we know about it, and you know, are there other possibilities for how we might do this? It's very difficult to step out of your own human nature and think of other ways of conceptualizing how we move around in the world. But
it is, but in large part, that's what science does. Science allows us to step outside our minds and have a more accurate picture of reality than the one that evolution supplied us with. An example is that in physics, there is, in the various theories of time, none of them have a concept of now as being a privileged point. The concept of past, present, and future doesn't enter into the laws of physics. Likewise, the idea of impetus, the idea of an agent applying a force on an object which it then carries with it until it dissipates, is the natural way in which we conceive of physical interactions. But of course, Newton blew it out of the water. And many of the fallacies that students make before they have internalized Newtonian physics correspond to the mental model of the world that gets expressed in language.
so actually at the boundaries of science then, that it seems like language is almost a hindrance.
I wouldn't say it's a hindrance so much as that the construal of the world on which language is based, which extends beyond language to our common sense reasoning, that is in large part a hindrance. That a lot of science education and a lot of the progress of science consists of debugging or unlearning the intuitions that we bring into the lab. The intuition, for example, that every kind of animal has an essence that makes it that kind of animal. You can't have evolution if you believe that. You've got to start thinking of species as populations that can vary continuously in traits, and the distribution of traits can change over time. But that's very different of thinking of cats as having a kind of catness that determines their catty features.
Now, will challenges like quantum physics, for example, at the boundaries of science, then, ever really make sense through the lens of language?
Well, because language is a combinatorial system, that is, we don't have a finite list of messages that we pick from a list, but we've got a grammar that allows us to combine nouns and verbs in an explosive number of combinations. Also, language has in it metaphor, not metaphor in the sense of a literary ornament, but metaphor in the sense of allowing us to take an idea that works for one system, bleach out all of the content that's specific to that system, and apply it to a second system. We do this all the time in language. We don't even realize it. When we say John went from sick to well, we use spatial verbs, went, from, and to, even though we don't mean that he literally moved. It's as if his health moved in a kind of state space. Now that's the kind of ability of taking concrete language, erasing the concrete bits, and applying that skeleton to more abstract domains that we use in science all the time. And I suggest in the book that the combination of metaphor and analogy with the combinatorial power of language is what allows language to express thoughts, such as scientific thoughts, that can be quite alien to our instinctive way of analyzing the world.
And outside of science, of course, metaphor is also one of your key themes in the book, and something that's very important to this power of language to be so combinatorial, so prolific, if you like.
That's right. So thermodynamics was originally conceptualized by an analogy to the flow of liquid. The atom was originally analogized to a solar system. Now, of course, you can't take the analogies at face value if you do serious science. You've got to say that the analogy works in this way and that way and this other way, but not in the following 7 ways. So you have to be, that's one major difference between the use of metaphor in science and in art. But nonetheless, scientific language is suffused with metaphor. A selection in the case of evolution. Of course, Darwin used the analogy of animal breeding. The genetic code originally meant something that cryptographers used. Now we think of it as an information mapping system. So science uses metaphors not just to communicate, but actually to pinpoint certain abstract systems that are often shared between the thing you're talking about and the source from which you drew the metaphor.
Sometimes when there's a new concept and there isn't already a way of expressing it, as you've just been telling us, we devise a new metaphor for it, or a metaphor that can allow us to compare one thing with a very similar thing. But at other times we might just make up a new word. I mean, what affects whether a particular word in the first place gets made up at all, and in the second place makes it into language or not?
It's often capricious what words will fill a gap in the lexicon, and which ones will catch on, both in the language as a whole and in scientific language in particular. The mere need for a word does not guarantee that it will spring into existence. We don't have a word for unmarried heterosexual partners, for example. To talk about, my girlfriend sounds a little juvenile when you're 53 years old. To talk about my partner makes people think that you're gay. To talk about my lovers just seems a little too romantic for, a dinner invitation. And despite the sexual revolution in the 1960s and the proliferation of unmarried heterosexual partners, no word has filled the gap. Likewise, there's no commonly accepted word for the first decade of the 21st century. The aughts, the noughts, the double O's, nothing really has caught on. And when a word does catch on, it's often unpredictable where it comes from. My favorite example is the term for bulk email, spam, which came from a Monty Python skit through a circuitous path. Science isn't immune to these waves of fashion and how where names came from. In several decades ago, the only legitimate way of introducing scientific jargon was to use a bit of Greek or Latin jargon. So you'd get terms like heteroskedasticity or apoptosis. Then I think with the greater informality of the culture as a whole, and probably the decline of classical Latin and Greek education, scientists started using common sense English descriptions like frequency-dependent selection, for example, or secondary messenger. And now, as I think a new and even less formal cohort of scientists has entered the profession, you get even whimsical coinages becoming acceptable scientific terms, like sonic hedgehog, as the name of a gene, quarks, which came from Murray Gell-Mann, brain, short for membrane, in physics, which cuts a word in the wrong place in a kind of whimsical way that's reminiscent of campus slang in physics, which cuts a word in the wrong place in a kind of whimsical way that's reminiscent of campus slang like shrooms for mushrooms or straubs for strawberry. So we see scientific language following some of the patterns in the language as a whole.
You're talking there about science becoming, and the jargon in science becoming less and less formal. Now, if we move to the less formal end of our linguistic spectrum, if you like, there's a much publicised chapter in the book about swearing in all its ungrammatical glory. So where exactly do these words come from that we now think are swear words, and why do they have the potency that they do?
One common denominator of the taboo words across different languages is they come from domains of strong negative emotion. There are taboo terms in many languages for deities and supernatural entities and their various relics and body parts, like our own hell, damn, and Jesus Christ, which involve the emotion of awe and fear of the power of deities. There are many taboo terms for bodily secretions in the organs that produce them, and that evokes the emotion of disgust. There are many sexual imprecations which evoke the emotion of revulsion at sexual depravity. There are often taboo terms for disliked people and groups, such as racial epithets. We don't think of those as dirty words, but of course they function like dirty words. The N-word is the word that could get you fired, whereas the F-word or the S-word no longer will. And that, of course, evokes the emotion of hatred for disfavored groups. But in all cases, there's a strong negative emotion. Now, that's not enough to make a word taboo. In addition, there has to be the recognition that the negative concept is being brought up precisely in order to offend you. And that's the difference between a taboo term like shit and the polite euphemism feces. They're synonyms, but we recognize one to be the term that you use in order to get a rise out of someone, and the other is the term that you use when you have to discuss the topic for some reason, but you want not to get a rise out of them.
Why don't they obey grammatical laws like other words then? Why is it okay to say, I don't give a bleep, or it's bleeping brilliant? I mean, those don't semantically mean anything. The words don't add anything to those sentences. And I couldn't intersperse other words that mean a similar thing into those sentences and mean the same thing.
That's right. You could even say things like kappa fucking chino or hot fucking dog, which violate all the rules of English. And also the semantics are nonsensical. Drown the fucking cat doesn't mean drown the cat that is fucking. The most likely source is that words can substitute for one another when they have the same emotional force, even if they have different grammatical and semantic properties. And I suspect that most of the very strange epithets, like close the fucking door, which doesn't seem to make any sense, evolved from religious epithets that lost their force as religion came to play a smaller role in our emotional lives. So close the goddamn door does make sense. If something is damned, then it is pitiable, execrable, of no earthly use. As damned started to lose its sting, but there still was that slot in the sentence, you used fuck to substitute for it. And all of the strange expressions with fuck have intelligible religious antecedents. Fuck you, which also makes no sense. No one knows what it means. I mean, if you ask people, everyone comes up with a different explanation. Came from damn you, or may God damn you. Where the fuck are you going? Came from where in the hell are you going? Holy shit, holy fuck came from Holy Mary. So you have a strange phenomenon, which I don't think you see anywhere else in the language, of words substituting for each other simply because of their taboo status, running roughshod over distinctions of grammar and meaning.
Well, I was going to conclude by asking about the flip side of swearing and cursing and how that has to be politeness. The reason why I would say, I don't suppose you'd like to sit here, Professor Pinker, as opposed to sit there, Steve. We have straightforward words for straightforward things, but why don't we just say what we mean a bit more often?
Yes. I think it's because humans are very touchy about their relationships. There are a number of different relationship types that govern human social interaction. Unlike other animals, which deal with each other in a very circumscribed number of ways, we can flip back and forth between the kind of distribution of resources that we have between a pair of people. So we have dominance, you give me what I want. We have reciprocity, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We have mutualism or communality. What's mine is thine, what's thine is mine. But you got to know which one is in force at a given time, because if you mix them up, you could do something seriously wrong. I can help myself to a shrimp off the plate of my wife or girlfriend at a party, but I can't go up to a stranger or my boss and help myself to a shrimp off their plate. That would be larceny. A married couple can solicit each other for sex, but not a student and a professor. When we use language, sometimes the actual proposition that we use changes the relationship. And if you're uncertain that the other person is ready to do that, then you're taking a risk that if they're not willing to go along with it, your relationship is forever changed. As in a sexual come-on, you can no longer pretend that you're colleagues or friends if the sexual proposition has been made in the open, at least not on pain of being irrational or manipulative. On the other hand, if the sexual come-on is veiled, then the recipient can choose to pretend that it was a literal request to see etchings or to have coffee, turn it down without both parties having to acknowledge that they have switched from one relationship type to another. And so it is with polite requests. If I request the salt through some imperative, as linguists call it, like if you could pass the salt, that would be great, then I haven't bossed you around. But since you assume that I haven't lost my mind, that I'm not just talking in non sequiturs, you know that I really do want the salt. And so we accomplish both the relationship maintenance and the communication of information simultaneously.
Now, I have one final question for you, and it's really just out of curiosity. Do you have a favourite word that you think should be in the English language and isn't?
Oh, like a sniglet?
Yes, like a sniglet.
Or a liff to allude to Douglas Adams and book The Meaning of Liff, words that don't exist but should. Well, I think a hextable is useful. That is the one record album in someone's collection that makes you sure you could never go out with them. And a lamb lash, the folder full of astoundingly dull information found on hotel dressing tables. Both
Wonderful.
Courtesy of Douglas Adams and John Lloyd.
My favourite of theirs is it has to be walking into the kitchen and forgetting why you went there in the first place. Stephen Pinker, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.